coming. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your alumni family and friends weekend to be with us on such an important and timely issue. And the elections, right? We all are big consumers of polls these days. Everybody's getting polls all the time in the news and their news feeds. And so I thought it would be really helpful if we could get some experts together and give us a deeper sense of how to understand and make sense of all this polling information that's out there. So let me just tell you about, my name is Scott Spitzer, and I'm a professor of political science here at Cal State Fullerton. I'm also the director of a town hall meeting program that we run every year in the spring, where students work with local public officials from all over the county. My focus in my teaching has been on American politics and policy making, everything from the introductory course on American politics to the master's level seminar, and in between. And I also focus a lot on, I teach a class on media and politics, so there's a lot of areas which dovetail with today's topic. And my research focuses on the presidency, mostly in policy making, and you'll find it in Presidential Studies Quarterly, Congress and the Presidency, the Journal of the 60s, and a number of other places. Dr. Stambough is just recently retired, or is that retired right now? Also professor of political science here at Cal State Fullerton. His research focuses on campaign election behavior, mostly focusing on women in politics, but I think he can talk to you about a lot of different things. And he's published in a lot of leading journals on that subject, including the Journal of Politics, Politics and Gender, Politics, Groups and Identities, some really great top name journals. And here at Cal State Fullerton, he was the chair of my division of Politics and Administration Justice. He was also the academic Senate chair 3 times. What were you thinking? And he was the founding, most importantly, the founding director of the Cal State DC Internship program. And lastly, Laura Gil-Trejo is the director of our Social Science Research Center here at Cal State Fullerton. And as director, she secures overseas contracts with all sorts of different nonprofit agencies, government agencies, both at the regional and state levels. And her expertise is survey methodology. So she can talk to us a lot about how polls actually get done, right? Including the design of them, the strategies to draw representative samples, how to interpret the survey results, and then how to present that professionally. Over the last 15 years, she's overseen over 50 survey projects. That's a huge amount of work for clients like Orange County Healthcare Agency, California Air Resources Board, City of Brea, and more. So, and she, I'll be referencing this in my talk a little bit, is a member of the American Association of Public Opinion Research. And we can leave us to your comments. So let's get right to it. Now you know a little bit about the 3 of us. And so I'll introduce us broadly and historically to thinking about polling and elections. How did we get to this point where public opinion polls are so intertwined with how everybody thinks about elections? And it's not just how we see elections, the voters, but it's also how the campaigns operate and how the media operate, how the media report on public opinion and polling, all intertwined with this really important subject. Once I do that, then Laura's going to give us some insights about how our polls are actually done, and Steve's going to wrap us up with focusing on the current elections and the current polls and how we should be thinking about what we're reading in our news feeds and what we're seeing in our television news about these polls. Then we'll open it up and we'll have plenty of time to take questions from you guys. So definitely be thinking about questions you would like to ask us about anything we're speaking about or other things as well. All right, so thinking about our elections today, it's basically impossible to think about without polls. But when we think about the history of this, the really modern scientific survey research began in presidential races in 1936 after George Gallup. That name probably sounds familiar to you, the Gallup poll. But Gallup was new on the scene, and he predicted, he used scientific sampling methods to predict that FDR was going to win that election in 1936, while the very famed Literary Digest mistakenly predicted that person that you never remembered, Al Landon, was going to win this election by a large amount. And here was the problem, the Literary Digest did what they always did. They sent out a lot of postcards to millions of people. And, but they always, who did they send it out to? People who own telephones, people who own cars. That's how they came up with their list. So they sent out these postcards to all these folks. And of course, in 1936, it was the working class and poor farmers who made the decisive break for FDR. And they were not included in this effort to hold the country, this straw poll effort. And so that was their first big mistake of selection bias, where the sample that was used was selected in a biased way. And then you make a mistake, right? So since that time, first of all, the Literary Digest went out of business the next year. And it was a big deal magazine at the time, it had a huge circulation. And there's been a giant increase in the number of polls that are fielded right before the election. Well, everybody wants to predict who's going to win, right? In 2020, the American Association of Public Opinion Research, which was the number said that there were 97 pollsters who ran over 500 national polls. That was the last time around. I think we're probably exceeding that this time around. Over 100 of those polls were in the last 2 weeks of the campaign. Now, if you're thinking, well, those are national polls, what about the state? At the state level, there were over 1,500 polls in 2020. And about close to, well, almost 1,000 of those were in the battleground states, those states that could have gone either way, most competitive states. 350 of those battleground state polls were in the last 2 weeks of the election. So we're awash in these polls. But as long as people have been having elections, people want to predict who's going to win. So how do we do it back before polls? Well, people would ask insiders, party leaders, or they would look at the outcome in earlier elections in so-called bellwether states, right? Now, starting in 1824, when we first started having voting for presidential elections, we would have these straw polls where we'd send out postcards and ask people how they're planning to vote in taverns like bars. They would go to bars, they would go to the militias, the state militias, and they'd ask people, how you plan to vote? And then they would predict who's going to do that. Now, unlike a lot of the survey research that Laura's doing, with election polls, there's always this moment of truth, right? The pollsters go out there, they collect this information, they predict who's going to win, and then we find out actually who won. So we know when they're right and when they're wrong. And this has gotten a lot of news, right? In recent years, everybody's focused on how poorly the polls have done. But that's not really all that new. Like I said, Literary Digest right after 1936 went out of business. 1948, we all know that famous picture of President Truman holding up the Chicago Tribune with that giant headline saying, Dewey wins, right? And smiling his Truman smirk, right? Kiplinger magazine, which was also a major circulation magazine at that time, had gone so far as to print up a whole bunch of issues telling us what to expect out of the Dewey presidency. And they started to send these out. Well, his magazine went out of business in 1949. John Zogby, let's fast forward to today. who was widely respected because he was the only pollster in 1996 who understood that Clinton was going to win by a lot of votes in that election over Robert Dole, 1996, when President Clinton was re-elected president. So a lot of people thought he was like, you know, an amazing pollster. But since that time, his reputation sort of declined and kept missing the outcomes. And so much so that Nate Silver, you guys might have heard of Nate Silver, the famed 538, said that John Zogby in 2009 called him the, quote, worst pollster in the world. It's not a nice thing to be called, right? In 2004, Fox News said, hey, John Kerry is going to get 48% of the vote. And they were absolutely right. That's how much they got. But they were totally wrong in predicting that Kerry was going to win the election. It was George W. Bush winning the election that year. And of course, in 2016, the polls seemed to get it all wrong about Hillary Clinton. Actually, they were really close. First of all, they predicted her share of the national vote total correctly, quite accurately. And they got the swing states within the range of error, 1%, 2% off. They were absolutely right. But we think of that as a big fiasco for the polling industry. They all made the same error in the same direction, predicting a Hillary Clinton win in that year, within the margin of error. In 2020, however, the polls predicted a much larger win for Joe Biden over Donald Trump in the swing states than what actually ended up happening. He won the election nonetheless. He won by narrower margins in those swing states than polls had predicted. So much so, though, that the American Association of Public Opinion Research said, we have really failed. They saw 2020 as a much bigger failure than 2016. But most people see 2016 as the polls were wrong, 2020, they got it right. So we have to think about how we understand our polls and how we are evaluating them. Question is, why is it so hard to do this well? I mean, it's 2024. We've got a lot of statistical understanding. We have computers, right? Most polls are done not just with questions done in person over the phone, but multi-methods, meaning we do internet polling, we do text message polling, we do telephone call polling. We are very sophisticated in how we weight our samples to take into account the actual demographics of the population and previous voting patterns. But polls are, we need to remember that polls are estimates. They're always estimates. Educated estimates, but nonetheless estimates. And every polling organization has its own house effects, right? Most importantly, the big thing is, how do they decide who are the likely voters? Because that's what we want to know about. Among likely voters, you'll see this all the time. Among likely voters, this percentage of voters are favoring Harris over Trump or Trump over Harris. So the question is, how do we know who are the likely voters? In 2016 and 2020, pollsters had a really hard time adequately sampling exactly the sorts of voters that were much more likely to vote for Trump. Rural voters, uneducated white voters. They're harder to find, and they don't like answering polls. They don't want to answer polls. Who wants to answer polls? Educated voters living in metropolitan areas. And so this is an ongoing challenge for the polling industry. Let me just introduce one more difficult piece in 2024, racial politics, right? Racial politics makes things a little bit dicey, right? Back in 2008, when Obama was running at the top of the ticket, there was a lot of concern that people were going to say, oh yeah, I'm going to vote for Obama. But then they would have the so-called Tom Bradley effect, where people said they would vote for Tom Bradley, LA mayor, African-American LA mayor, for governor, to the pollsters, but then in the actual election, were more likely to vote for Duke Majan, who ended up winning. That was actually not a real effect. The social science on this, but ever since then, there's this concern that voters are not telling the truth when they're asked, would you vote for a Black candidate, right? And in this case, would you vote for a woman candidate? Would you vote for a Black woman candidate? So we're concerned that maybe the voters are not telling us what they really are going to do because they're embarrassed to say that they would never vote for a woman or they would never vote for a African American. Another issue, and I know Steve's going to talk about this, is will people change their mind last minute or decide last minute? So panel data has shown us, right, when you look at the same people, we interview them a number of times, the same exact people. Those panel research projects have showed us that about 40% of voters changed their vote intention more than one time during the campaign. Many of us might be familiar with our own indecision, trying to figure out who we're going to support, right? And that explained a lot what happened in 1948. So going back to Truman, one of the big problems was that pollsters called the election for duty 3 weeks before the election. And in that next 3 weeks, a whole bunch of voters wrote for Truman in the last few weeks, and that decided the election. Now, polling is changed a lot dramatically, and we have huge numbers of online text-based polling, tons of mixed methods, as I said, but it's getting harder and harder to get people to answer. I'm sure Laura's experienced this, but one estimate said in some of the local and state races, when we ask people to answer polls, people are hanging up, they get less than a 1% response rate. And the question is, are the people who hang up the phone looking at the elections the same way as the people who actually answer the survey? Can the people who actually answer the survey be seen as a representative sample if 97, 98, 99% of people we're reaching out to refuse to answer the poll? And then, right, so finally, there's this new thing of polling aggregators. I mentioned 538 before. You might have heard of Real Clear Politics. And these, the idea is that they take an average of all these polls, and that when they do that, the house effects of one polling organization versus another polling organization cancel each other out. And so they get a more accurate, holistic picture of where the race stands. But here's the problem. In 2016, all of the house effects broke in the wrong direction. What happens when all of the house effects make errors in the same direction? So 2024, the pollsters are working doubly hard to make sure that they don't undersample Trump voting blocks. And some are now arguing that maybe they're getting it wrong again, biased against the Democrat. That's not unheard of. In 1992, pollsters missed after Reagan's landslide in 1980, when they were mistaken about Reagan winning by such a large margin. They tried to correct for that, and in 1992, they missed Clinton running ahead with that election. So let me conclude by saying that polls are not the only way we can predict elections. There are political science models that try to predict election outcomes based on the state of the economy and the popularity of the incumbent. The most famous, or probably less known of these, is the Time for a Change model by Alan Abramovitz, which has an excellent track record. And Abramovitz is now predicting a narrow victory for Kamala Harris. And then there's the gambling, the gamblers, you probably heard of this, people who actually bet on elections. There was a few days ago, the DC Court of Appeals decided in favor of a new startup company, Kashli, I think it's called, which wants to take bets on the outcome of the election. And there's a lot of people say, wow, if people are willing to bet their money on this outcome, they must know something that we don't. And right now, the Poly Market, which is a crypto market trading platform, says that Harris has a 14 electoral college point edge. But think about who these people are who are vetting, right? They typically are men, they typically are well educated, and they typically have a lot of money. So are they really a good indicator of what's going to happen in these elections? One thing I can tell you, we have no crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen on November 5th, in the time leading up to that. But the polls tell us a lot of what to look at. For example, we know that there are 7 swing states that we need to be paying very close attention: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina. These are the states where likely the outcome of the presidential election will be decided. Okay, but we don't know, and the other thing we know is that it's likely to be a very close election. Okay, so Laura, how do these polls work? How do we know what we know?
So I'm here today to talk about how we conduct professional surveys. And in our center, we do both political polls and surveys that ask about other things, other opinions, behaviors, and so forth. And so one of the things that I wanted to share with you is that a lot of the ways that we do polls really are dependent upon the parameters that are set by the funder. So this includes things like what is it that they want to learn and from whom do they want to learn it. Things like how much money they have and how much time they have. These kinds of things dictate how we do our survey. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is sort of the steps that I go through to conduct a survey, and I do it in almost every survey. Unless a client comes in and says, I really want to do an opt-in online panel, they come in knowing what they want. So I'm going to present these things in steps, but in reality, they're always happening together in tandem with each other. So the first thing is that I spend a lot of time with our clients on their survey design and their questions. One of the things that we want is we want clear, understandable questions that are easily understood by a variety of different kinds of people. So I work with them to make sure that their survey items achieve that goal. And so I'm working with things so I'm looking for things like, does their survey contain a lot of jargon? Or do they contain words that not all of the population might know, like Trans-Pacific Partnership? Not everybody would know that, so we try to not. So when we're trying to assess people's opinions on that particular issue, we want to describe that before we introduce it. We're looking for things like, you want to avoid double negatives in your survey. You want to not preface your question in a way that might swing somebody to answer in one direction or another. The other thing that you want to do is you want to try to prevent something called acquiescence bias. And that is just in general, people have a tendency to be agreeable. And so we find with like yes, no type items or strongly agree, disagree type items, that you'll find that people are more likely to endorse a particular opinion if you state it to them that way. So like a good example that I have is, and I might forget it because I'm a little bit nervous, but when you ask people a question, something like, do you strongly agree or agree that military strength is a way to ensure peace? They show something like 43% of people agree with the statement or strongly agree with the statement. But when you preface the question in a way that you ask people to pick which of the following statements best describes your opinion, right? Military strength is the best way to ensure peace. And the other statement is diplomacy is the best way to ensure peace. What they find is a lower rate of agreement with statement military strength is a way to ensure peace. So the other things that we're thinking about with survey design, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but is you want to try to keep your survey at 10 minutes or shorter. People are busy. I used to recommend 12 minutes. Now I'm recommending 10. I find that it's really difficult to get clients to stick to that. They always want to go a little bit more. That costs a little bit. That costs more in terms of money. It costs in response rate. The other thing is when we design a survey, if the client has enough time and has enough funding, I always recommend they do something called cognitive interviewing with their survey. And that's basically a qualitative type method where you sample about 18 or so members of your population, and you sit with them and you administer the survey to them and you ask them, what does this question mean to you? What does this word mean to you? How are you interpreting this question? And those cognitive interviews help you adapt your survey so that it's better. And then finally, with all survey design, we administer a pilot test where you take like about 30 to 40 members of the population and you administer a survey. And you take a look at the distribution of responses. You're looking for kind of anomalies or anything that would tip you off to the fact that people are either not understanding your question or you're biasing them in certain ways. And so that's how we kind of advise in terms of survey design. Second thing that's happening at the same time as all the survey design is happening is you're trying to decide what modality you want to administer your survey in, right? In the 30s and 40s, it was mostly administered in person, house by house, right? And as methodologies developed whereby it became easier to develop random telephone numbers to generate lists of random telephone numbers, telephone surveys became very popular in the 80s. And that's how I got introduced to the field, was by telephone survey. Since then, that methodology has pretty much been almost extinguished by the fact that people don't answer their telephones. You also have online methods, and which I think are the predominant way that people are polling nowadays. And then you have mail-based methods, which are still very popular. And actually, in our experience, garner a larger response rate than any of the other methods. So you want to decide, and of course, all of these things have expenses tied to them, right? So if somebody's coming in with a really low budget, they're going to always lean towards online. In person tends to be the most expensive, and with telephone following next, and then mail. Mail and telephone actually tie with respect to expense because it actually costs a lot of money to print material and to mail them. And you don't just mail them once, right? You mail it twice or 3 times because you're trying to boost response rate. So these are the things that I'm helping our clients consider when it comes to how you want to administer the survey. And one of the things that they've really seen happen, and it's happening in our shop too, is this profusion of multimodal surveys where you try to reach people in a variety of different ways, which is, if a client comes in with a large enough budget, is how I would recommend that they go about it. It introduces some other problems that I have time to talk about, I will. But multimodality, multimodal methods tend to be something that people are favoring more and more. So what's also happening at the same time that these things are happening is we're trying to decide who is going to get into the survey, right? So how are we going to get people into the survey? And the goal always, when you're trying to conduct a survey, is you're trying to get a sample of people who look more or less similar to the target population from where they came. So usually your client will come in with their target population in mind. I want likely voters. That's what we're talking about right now. Others could be all Americans over the age of 18, all Californians over the age of 18, all drivers. So they come in with their target population in mind. Our job is to try to help them figure out how to get to that target population as best we can, as representatively as possible. And to do that, the best way to do that is by randomly selecting members of your target population such that everybody in the population has an equal or known chance of getting into your sample. A lot of pollsters are using another kind, which is non-probability sampling. And non-probability sampling, you don't know what the chance is that you're going to get into your sample. And you see this a lot. You guys might have heard in opt-in online panels are these sort of non-probability online surveys. We recommend always probability sampling when possible, if possible, and sometimes it's not possible. And so we need, so once we've decided, here's the population, here's how we're going to get them, either probability or non-probability, then comes, well, where are we going to get the raw material to get these people from? And we work with professional vendors, and their only job is to create lists of individuals that you can reach for surveys. And so I'll talk about an older methodology now, which is the phone. They have methods to randomly generate telephone numbers such that everybody who owns a phone has an equal chance of being in the sample. And it used to be that we only used to work with landline, so that these were randomly generated landline numbers, but now only 23% of people in the United States have landlines. And so now we're incorporating, well, I say we're incorporating, but we used to incorporate when we did cell phone, randomly generated cell phone numbers. And typically it's done, and like there's a blend, so you do like 90% cell phone and 10% landlines. You blend these, they're called sample frames. Sample frames are just lists of individuals that you are going to contact, and they typically are a proportion of your target population, but in some cases they're the entire target, population. So I'll give you an example. Cal Optima wanted to know about the health behaviors and the attitudes of its members. And so Cal Optima gave us a frame, which is a list of all of their members. And so in that case, the frame literally equaled the target population. But in most cases, the frame was a proportion of the target population, right? You're not going to get all the numbers of every person living in the United States. You're going to get a sample. And we determine how many records to buy based on what we think the likely response rate is going to be based on past experience, right? So we're seeing response rates in the ballpark of 3 to 4%. If you have less time, right? One of the things about political polls, the reason we don't like doing them so much is they have to be done really quickly. Because some kind of historical fact might pop in there that changes opinion in a dramatic way. And so these polls that are done in like a shorter time frame typically have lower response rates. So we work with these vendors to produce these lists for us. They also produce lists of randomly generated addresses because the U.S. Postal Service now maintains a list of all the addresses in the United States. And so that's called address-based sampling. They also procure for us a list of registered voters, which, depending on when you buy that list, you might have people registering sort of as you get closer and closer to the election. So you might miss those people who do registered voters. Dr. Spitzer was talking about how people want to know what likely voters are going to think. Well, those voter registration files have data contained in them so that you can use that data to help sort of hone in on your sample. So for example, you can ask for a random list of people who voted in the last 2 years, and that's how they get at likely voters. That becomes problematic in election years where you have people who show up to vote who would not normally show up to vote. But my point is that there are vendors that sell these lists, and these records, these files are called sample frames, and those are the people that we contact. It turns out that they also have lists of non-probability based samples. So for example, listed telephone numbers are lists that they sell as well. They're non-probability based, right? The only people who are in them are people who have listed telephone numbers. And things like, it's called an enhanced wireless frame, whereby consumer data is used to generate lists of cell phone numbers that are more likely to be in a target geography. And they do this because of something called cell phone portability. If I were to buy a list of cell phone numbers that were randomly generated, they use the area code and exchanges and then randomly generating the last 4 digits to make that list for you. You're going to be missing people who have New York area codes that now live in Orange County. So this is why pollsters and professionals who make design visuals sometimes blend these non-probability and probability samples together to try to get greater coverage. Let's see, so while this is also happening, we are programming the survey. If we're doing online, well, I wanted to go back and say the way that we're recommending now people do surveys if they have the resources is that they use address-based sampling, and that they send out a pre-notification letter to the units that are selected, basically saying, this is who we are, this is what we're doing, this is going to come to you in the next week. And that pre-notification letter is followed up with a postcard, and that postcard contains a link to an online survey with a QR code. And it also has a message that says, if you want to receive the survey over your phone, text survey to, and we include our number. And so after that postcard goes out, we watch the response for about a week and a half. Anybody who responds to the survey, we pull them out of our list, and what's left over gets a reminder postcard. So that, again, this is like time has to be on your side here. And then to add sort of a multimodal element into it, we include something in our messaging that says, if you want to receive a mail survey, give us a call, give us a text, we'll send you a mail survey. Those people who don't respond over postcard or they don't respond online, we will email people for whom there are email addresses appended to their address, their physical address. And then people who don't respond to that, we will call people who don't respond using the other ways. And so you can take it even further, you can go out and do a visit to those, and those are usually associated with hard to reach populations. So that is how I would recommend if the time and money is on your side, because you get the greatest response rate using these methods. But depending on which way you're doing your survey, you're going to have to program your survey either through Qualtrics. We use Qualtrics, which is an online platform, or for phone, we use something called WinCaddy, and CADDY stands for Computer Assisted Telephone Interviewing. And either way, when you're programming your survey, it's a very complicated process that takes quite a bit of time, because you don't just program it. Once you've programmed it, you have to make sure that it works exactly the way the survey works, right? So the survey comes with skip patterns and branches. So you have to go in there. What we do is we recruit like 6 to 12 interviewers that go in, and their job is to pretend that they're taking the survey, and pretending that they're taking the survey has many different kinds of respondents. So a respondent that takes this path, a respondent that takes this path. So your job is to go in there and pretend you're a respondent and try to basically break the survey programming, which is finding errors. Those breaks get reported to the programmer, they fix it, it gets broken again, it gets fixed. So it just keeps going until there's no more breaking that can happen. And then finally, we do something called like fake data collection, where we have, again, these 12 interviewers and they're entering pretend data, fake data. And then we have these meetings where we review that data, and what you're looking for is breaks in the survey that you can only find through entering and looking at the fake data. Yeah, so there's this technical process of programming the survey and making sure that it works exactly the way it's supposed to. Even then, sometimes there are still breaks in the survey that we don't detect going through that rigorous method, which is why we recommend doing a pilot survey before going full scale, before you mail out to everybody. Because we operate in an academic institution, we're required to get institutional review board approval before we go into the field. And their job is basically to ensure that we're minimizing risk, weighing the risk with the benefit to the survey. And then we go into the field once we have that approval and once all of those other steps have been accomplished. And things that we're doing while we're in the field is monitoring the data as it's being collected. We actually found a really interesting error in a survey where it wasn't functioning the way that it was supposed to when people were entering dollar signs in their answers. So it was breaking the survey, but we didn't detect it during the pilot. So you're monitoring the survey data as it's coming in. And you know, depending on if your client has a budget to allow us to do this, we're following up with respondents whose data is questionable or kind of points to something that's going on. If you're doing live interviewing, you're monitoring the interviewers to make sure that there's no biases that are being entered into the survey as it's happening. I once had an interviewer who kept saying, "Oh yeah, that's a good response. That's a great response." You're like, please stop doing that. You know, you're leaving them to answer in a certain way. So there's monitoring telephone interviewers or live interviewers. So there's lots of mechanics that are happening as the data is being collected. And then finally, at the end, you have a data file and you have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to weight that data file or not. And weighting the data file is just a way to assign a unit in your sample frame, either a greater weight or a lower weight, depending on whether that person is underrepresented or overrepresented in in your sample. So for example, volunteers are overrepresented in your sample. We'll actually have a hard time measuring volunteers. But like, so for example, if highly educated people are more overrepresented, they're overrepresented in your sample, you would weigh them down so that they represent less of the first cohort unit than they are. And if on the other hand, you have people who are uneducated or white males that happen to be underrepresented in your sample, you want to give them a higher weight than what they're actually represented in your sample file. Most of our clients take their data and they analyze it and they go away and they don't ask us to do the data analysis for them. We can, but we typically don't. But what we are typically asked to do is to produce a methodological report. And the methodological report is basically a recipe for conducting the study. And the way that we like to do our methodological reports is we like to imagine that Dr. Spitzer or Dr. Stambough are going to take our survey and they're going to replicate it exactly as we did it. We want to give them as much information as possible so that they're able to do that. And we find that not a lot of survey houses do this, where we're supposed to take a survey that's been done before in the past, and we can't figure out how we did it because the report didn't detail enough what happened. But we belong to an initiative at the American Association for Public Opinion Research called the A4's Transparency Initiative. And their goal is to try to facilitate transparency in the conducting of professional surveys. And so to be a member, you have to turn in your technical reports, and they judge whether or not you're allowed to be in their transparency initiative. And so we're a member of the initiative. There's just a lot there, so I don't want to take anybody's time.
Thank you so much. That was really informative, interesting, and I'm sure very few of us know what's happening at home behind the scenes. So, Steve, tell us what do you think about this stuff now as we're reading the polls and our news feeds?
So, yeah, what I'd like to talk about a little bit and focus in is a little bit about how to use this. Use it as voters, use it as consumers of political information. What does it mean? Highlighting a couple of things, just kind of refresh a bit. We know from the history lesson that Scott gave, being American political development, being an historian basically, and then listening to the technical report that we just had tomorrow, you see that polling has really gotten much more common and much more sophisticated. So from the days of Literary Digest polls, sending out stuff kind of at random, almost, it wasn't random, but pretty bad. They didn't realize what their sampling problem was going to be. To now, where the industry, yes, they will do things, they will occasionally get some stuff wrong, but it's also I would say like self-regulating, self-correcting, so they try to correct it the next time. If we got it wrong, we get it wrong. One thing that in terms of a lot of the political coverage we get, where things go wrong, for the most part, really isn't in the polling. I mean, there are some polls that are bad. Scott mentioned that there is a proliferation of just a ton of alternate groups out there. Some are bad, some are almost bad by design. And what I mean by that is that over the last several election cycles, there are the aggregators that Scott mentioned, 538, for politics. Once you know how something is going to work, so basically they would average out all the polls. And when you're talking about a handful of polls that are from relatively reputable places that do good work, then it can actually tell you something. You try to look for wherever the movement actually is. But as soon as those became available, then people were like, they're going to aggregate. We'll just put up a really bad poll that's going to reflect a little bit more of what my side wants, and it's going to shift that average to the news story. Out of that becomes that the aggregate is reporting a lot of bad polls that are skewing it to the left or skewing it to the right or whatever it is. So as soon as you know that there is kind of a measure, a game that's being played, then you know how to try to manipulate that game. So the aggregators, you can still get decent information out of them, but we focus too much on it. And I think that's part of my main point is that my critique, it's not really a critique of the polling, it's a critique of the use of polls. And it's a critique of the media coverage of the polls. So I just pulled up, and again, this is one of the aggregators, 538, just looking at the front page. It's got Nevada, Harris by 1, and Georgia, Trump by 1. They will report that as Nevada, Harris is winning, and Georgia, Trump is winning. That's not true, that's not what the poll is saying. What it says is that they're tied. Our best guess is maybe at 1 point. Okay. But what it's really saying is that it's time. What does that mean as consumers of information trying to figure out what the state of the race is? It means between now and then, if somebody has a big event that really shifts things their way, or whoever has the better ground game, it's the campaign part as opposed to the election part. Who has the better ground game? So if it's that close to any of those states, it's gonna be who turns out, who gets their voters out, and who doesn't. It's pretty much what it is. So where is the state of the race at this point? The state of the race at this point seems to be, for most of the national polls, Harris maybe by about 3. Give or take a few points. If you really want to pick one point, and the polls do that, make you pick one as a point estimate. But it's the best guess, but it's really within this range. Interpret that not just in terms of the 1,500 people they have in the survey that during the day. Interpret the information based upon the political context of what we've seen over the last few cycles. So some of the technical stuff, talk about, okay, who voted in the past? How do we get likely voters? We don't need to go through the entire list like the pollsters do of, okay, who were the likely voters, who voted over the last 2 election cycles, who did, and all that kind of stuff. But we know what things have occurred over the last 2 election cycles. Roughly what percentage of the vote did Donald Trump receive in 2016? Anyone want to just toss out a number? Guess?
45%.
Yeah, right about there. It was 46.2, if I remember correctly. And I had that because I wrote it down like half an hour ago. So, yeah, so it was right about 46. What did he receive in 2020? 46.8. How much of a difference? Was there anything different between 2016 and 2020? There's a lot of things that were different between 2016 and 2020, right? 2016, there were not viable, visible third-party candidates. So there's Gary Johnson running as Libertarian who received a few percentage points, and Samuel Stein. So it was a little bit more of a different type of race than it was in 2020, where there really wasn't that. It was pretty much Biden and Trump. That was it. It was also COVID. It was also with COVID brought what for the elections, besides the issues and besides everybody trying to figure out how to just do with life at that moment and all the stuff in terms of a lot of the George Floyd issues and stuff going outlined at the same time. There was a lot of things going on. There was a change in the way we conducted elections because people didn't want to go to polling places during COVID. So there was a lot more absentee voting that went on. All that change went from 46.2 to 46.8. That's not a lot. Remember, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, even though she didn't win the electoral college vote. She beat Trump by about 3 percentage points. Biden beat Trump by, what was it, about 4 percentage points, 5 percentage points at most. That's really tiny. That's not a lot of movement. So looking at it now, I don't expect much movement either. It seems like Trump seems to have, and this is based on polling, and it is based on polling within a greater political context. That's probably the best way to understand the polling, is put it within the greater political context. There wasn't a lot of movement from the Republicans, there wasn't a lot of movement from the Democrats, even with 2020 being a year that nobody wants to relive because it seemed like anything and everything happened that year. So with all that chaos, there's still stability in the political system, in the preference of the voter. So what does that mean for us? I mean, when I used to teach, I would explain this part. What does the polls mean to you as a voter? It shouldn't mean anything to you as a voter. One of them's going to win, one of them's going to lose. Is your vote going to change? Should your vote change based on who you think is winning and who you think is losing? You should vote for who you think is going to be better. Not who you think is going to win, not who you think is going to lose. You vote and your side loses, work harder the next time, but don't be sad about your vote because your side lost. You voted based upon your preference. Now, where it does come into play isn't who you're going to vote for, but whether you're going to vote. And that's where the polling and the narrative and a lot of the spin can have an impact on what the electorate looks like. So this is a little bit of the bandwagon stuff, and I'm going to bring up a slightly different example for 2020, even though it's ability and we're going to get into questions, is voting choice isn't Trump, Harris. It wasn't Biden, Trump. It was, am I going to vote or am I not? And then, who am I going to vote for? So one thing that in 2020, and in a couple of interviews that he's given, Donald Trump seems to really believe, because he was told by his political experts, if you get 75 million votes, you are going to win. Because they were basing it on an electorate that looked a lot different, and just in terms of turnout, than what 2020 ended up happening. So eventually with COVID, every state just like opened up the absentee ballot possibilities, made it much easier to do that. That increased voter turnout. It was so much easier to vote at your kitchen table than to go and wait 2, 3, 4, 8, sometimes hours at a polling place. So voter turnout went up. So I think he truly believed if he got 75 million votes, he was going to win. He got the 75 million votes, but he didn't win because the electorate looked different, because people voted who otherwise wouldn't vote. So if I'm Harris, I need to replicate that. Now, the absentee voter laws really didn't get restricted too much from that. There's still that possibility, but it's not that people are staying home all the time, like we were in 2020. So if she is going to be able to turn this 2-3 percentage point thing into a win, it is going to be based upon her ground game in the states that are close. That's kind of the way I would use it. One, don't determine who your vote is going to be, because your vote should be based upon your own personal preferences. And two, realize that when the media reports something, you look at polls and you realize right now it's effectively tied. And by effectively tied, it means either one could win based upon what they do between now and election day. Maybe one is a slight advantage, but that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for us to remember, which you guys all know, which is that when it says plus or minus 3 percentage points, that's a 95% generally certainty. So they could be off again, even with that range, that sampling error range.
One thing I forgot before that we can answer the questions at that point is the other aspect that tends to get reported a decent amount, and it's an important question, is how are subgroups voting? How are they changing? So there's a lot of talk about, particularly younger African American males, they're moving more towards the Republican Party, particularly I want to say like 3rd or 4th generation Latino voters, particularly males, are they moving a little more towards the Republican Party. Some of the polls are showing yes, some are not. When you look at any of the reports on that, for me, the thing you have to look at is the sample size and whether or not there's an oversample of that in the population. Because if you have a national poll of 1,000 people, how many African Americans are going to be within that poll? 100? How many of them are going to be male? 50? You're talking about making conclusions based upon a poll of 50 people at that point. That's not enough to make it a legitimate claim. So maybe look at trends, maybe look at voter registration numbers in different communities and stuff like that. Those are going to give it a little bit more of a context of whether or not what we see in the polls have any credibility in terms of any movements within those communities.
Well, thanks. All right, well, thank you, you two. And let's open it. One thing I should say is I forgot to make a pitch for the ballot bowl. And I'll just very quickly say that if you've not yet registered to vote, we have voter registration forms here today, and you can also do it online. There's going to be a QR code that's available in this recording. So if you're watching it, you can use that QR code to register to vote up until October the 21st. You can still register in California online, and please register to vote. If you're a Titan, let them know that you're a Titan, because we're part of a competition, a friendly competition with all the different UCs and all the different CSUs and all the different community colleges in California to see which campus can register the most students to vote. So if you haven't registered to vote, it's time, and that's a great thing, because once you register to vote, you can help Cal State Fullerton beat Long Beach. So we're like right now, as of October the 6th, I think we're ahead by, I was told earlier, about 50 people ahead of Long Beach. So you can help liven that victory. All right. Anyway, let's open it up to you guys if you have questions, please.
Is there talking about political point, is there certain polls that you would suggest someone look at versus other, or there are ones that don't ever look at that, it's complete garbage kind of thing, or any kind of suggestions if we're wanting to look at polls but not have, be a bias in a sense? Is there any?
Well, I'll let the expert who knows the poll.
I'll throw a couple of names out there. And I think so most of the major TV ones, if it's just a question of who you're going to vote for, and it's just that general question of where the country is, they're generally generally okay. I mean, they're within a couple of percentage points of it. This is a little point of contention in the Trump campaign back in 2020. Fox News polls tend to be not favorable to him sometimes. He was really upset about the Arizona call, where their pollsters told him they're going to call Arizona for Biden that night. He was really upset about that. But their polling unit tends not to be as ideological as same like the thing with NBC. And NBC tends to be more on the left, Fox News is more on the right, but the polling agencies seem to be okay. If it's for a little bit more than just, okay, who's winning in this particular moment, but you can look at some of the groups, the Pew polls tend to be good. Pew Hispanic Trust particularly does, and for a long time, has been probably the speaker. We actually had a speaker a couple of weeks ago. I could hear the nice control of we were talking about Latino voting in 2024, but also beyond that. And there's Pew Hispanic Trust has put together this really good collection of polls, particularly about the population, but beyond that as well. So I would say Pew for a little bit more in-depth context, but for the horse race ones, and even the major media polls, do you know some that are I know there are some that are bad.
I would tend to not trust the ones that are, and they're not always bad, but the often non-probability panels, I would tend to stay away from those. They've had some problems. I was going to say Pew as well, and they use actually probability online panels a lot these days, which I talked a little bit about if anybody's interested. But I would look at the funder who's funding the poll. I would look for transparency in the methodology, right? So probability samples can be better than a non-probability sample. But I would generally agree that I would like to look at Pew as a sort of gold standard.
And it's really hard to find that information out, what you just talked about, like looking at the polling methodology and how they're doing that. You'll just get a number of how many people were interviewed and the plus or minus, and you have to do a little bit more research if you want to think about it. But I think, I think sort of the major newspapers like the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, they're very professional. They certainly don't want to have their proverbial pants down when the election returns. That's what I was saying at the beginning, with these election polls, unlike a lot of the work we do, there's going to be a true test, right? Were we right, were we wrong? And in 2020, they really were wrong. Actually, even though they predicted Biden to win, they said, oh, he's going to get like 8 percentage points. So they won by like 3 or 4 percentage points. Yeah.
So to my understanding, polling helps out political parties figure out if they need to do shifts and how to.
For sure.
Trying to figure out how to phrase this. How can individuals sign up for polling, or what is our role in helping these parties, or even helping candidates or propositions and things that we're trying to promote, I guess? What does that influence look like? I'm sorry.
No, that's a great question. I think in bringing up a really important point, which was that, polls are not just used by the media and public to understand what's happening in the election, but also, and one of the most important things that's been done is campaigns use this polling, and they do a lot of internal polling that they don't share with us. And a lot of what Steve was talking about, the subgroups, they want to know how, very narrow groups in the state of Nevada are likely to vote, right? How are metropolitan voters versus rural voters in Nevada likely to vote in 2000? And what issues do they care about? So that, or what's the most important to them? So that then they can then fine tune their campaign. And your question is well, how do I get to weigh in these surveys so that I can let the campaigns know what's important to me? I think there's other ways that are actually even more effective in polling in terms of that, which is to write letters and to let them know, emails, obviously, text, and to say, hey, how come you haven't been here? And how, this is because I know from working in government that we recognize that for every email or every letter we receive, there's 100 other people that think the same way. So that the letters and the emails matter a lot to people who are government. and campaign.
Thank you, that's a,
I would say probably for any one individual, the biggest impact you're gonna have is more local government.
Yeah,
So go to the meetings. Go to the local political party meetings, go to the city council meetings, go to the school board meetings, whatever it is. But within become involved in the local politics, whether it's a political party or political interest groups, something like that, you can help shape that, that's gonna have more of an impact. You aggregate that all the way up to the national level, it's really difficult. But one vote doesn't matter, one vote doesn't matter, your vote doesn't matter, but it's much more difficult at that level, but you do see shifts. So once kind of in the aggregate, there's kind of a little bit of a movement, you will see national politicians change. They're tuned on certain issues. You know, Harris has become much more stronger immigration than the Democratic Party was for several years, in part because of the polls. Trump is trying to walk a really fine line on abortion, saying, no, I don't really care if abortion is right or wrong, it's gonna be at the states, and I really care about being state level. It's not what he was saying. But the polls will push in that direction. Both of them will move based upon that because they're going after the votes. But for one individual, really the biggest impact is gonna go to the local level.
right, and there's a ton, we haven't even talked about congressional elections. In Orange County, you know, we are really critical to the outcome for which political party, the Democrats or Republicans, will control the majority of the House of Representatives. We have 6 very swinging districts that have gone back and forth over the last 3-4 election cycles, this way, that way, Democrat or Republican, and they're closely fought, and we redistricted them all. So, you know, if you wanna have a big impact, that's in Orange County, California. Yeah, the presidential election is really fascinating, we all care about that, but the congressional campaigns are really important as well. And then there's school boards and, board of supervisors, the Orange County Board of Supervisors election. That's a big deal, so, and we're not getting a lot of good polling information about this because they're expensive, right?
Yeah.
And so the campaigns, if you're running for Orange County Board of Supervisors, do you spend $10,000? I actually have no idea how much a poll costs these days. Last time I was involved in that was like over a decade ago. I think it was like $16,000 to do a fairly inexpensive poll.
What do you give them a discount,
Yes.
I'm not doing it, but the Orange County Board of Supervisors, should they spend that money on a poll or more advertisements on the radio, on television, slate mailers, that kind of thing, more volunteer, you know, supportive volunteers, that's where they're gonna spend their money.
Can we have the question you asked answered? How much?
How much? Oh, I heard you talk.
So they range depending on how much goes into them, right? But I would say that they range on the low end for a non-probability online panel from maybe 25 to 30,000, all the way up to $150,000 for a one. They really range, and people don't, you know, they don't want to spend money to do this. So we've definitely gotten a lot less work over the years than before, because it's become expensive. With the lowering response rate, it puts more demand on your need to like contact people. So response rates decreasing have increased the cost of survey professional surveys.
You have a question?
How do you guys, so it matters people who they have like easy access to some of the information so that they can do their own research. How do you guys make it so that they have like a mindset that how they decide matters, and what is like the buy-in for them to respond to a polling question interview or online, as well as helping people to access updated information for candidates and things that affect them even close to their city.
I think that's a great question for Laura. How do you get people to answer polls?
So it's really hard. We get yelled at a lot, and so this is where we talk about like modality, and there's a difference in modality in terms of how people respond. But like one of the benefits of phone survey is that you actually have a live interviewer to try to encourage somebody to participate in the survey. And we have people that we call refusal converters, And they're really good. Their job is to try to take somebody who's a refuser and try to convert them over to a completer. So having a really good introductory script is in trying to convince people why they need to participate. I would say the same kind of thing in communicating. If you're going to do mail outreach, is that you want to have a strong, good justification for why they want to complete. We find that the pre-notification mail actually helps improve response rate if you're going to do a survey, so letting them know that it's going to happen. And then there's also, I mean, we use incentives all the time to try to get people to participate in surveys. And I would always recommend, when possible, using an incentive to try to improve the response rate.
And the second part of your question, how do you get good information? Just as a
It's
voter?
more like a high mindset. How do you get people to say, all right, from our group, like Cal State Fullerton,
Yeah.
we, want to get involved. But how do you help people make it easier for them to get into that research and that group mindset?
Okay. You're right, Paul.
I mean, I think, as a faculty member, right, I spend a lot of time wanting to get my students to understand that democracy is not a spectator sport, and whether you do participate or don't participate, you're participating. Because by not voting, you're changing the outcome, right? So, Steve was talking about how these elections really, turnout is going to be so critical to determining the outcome. And that's even more the case when you get into these low turnout elections like school boards. And we're hearing a lot of politics about schools, right? Should we ban books? Should we have certain values in our schools? Should we not do that? And who's going to be on the school board with the matters? But less than 1%, like 1% of voters who are eligible are voting in these school board elections. So once you get that across, I think my job, in part, one of the reasons I want to do this is to try to get more people to register to vote and to understand that your participation actually does make a difference and matters, not only for the outcome of the election, but also for how our political leadership understand their priorities after they're elected. In other words, once people are elected, right, it's the biggest incentive to doing public policy making that serves different communities. For most politicians who are elected is that a voting group? Is that a group that matters for me to be reelected? Well, maybe I better do some more, for that group. Maybe I need to have more policies that serve the needs of that group, and make it very obvious so that they can continue to support me, or that they'll switch from the other party to me. So I think that's all the good reasons why people need to participate, but it's very hard because there's this general feeling in the United States, and maybe we should wrap up with this. Last word is like, and I think this is part of the difficulty in getting people to answer polls. There's such an antagonism towards government in the United States. People are just, they're all corrupt, they're not trustworthy, I don't want to be involved in politics, there's something negative about it. But we need to reclaim that, because democracy requires an engaged public. That's a good thing. When people are engaged and participating, thinking, debating, I believe that's a really good thing. And it's really, we need to actually work hard to convey it. So I hope that answers your question. So before we conclude, I'll just ask if you guys have any last words you want to
Well, I don't really have a lot of last words. I mean, doing telephone surveys or doing professional surveys is really technical and difficult work. It's challenging, but it's also quite fun. Lowering response rates or making our lives really difficult right now. We're looking forward to the future of this industry, and we hope that if we reach you, you will agree to participate in one of our surveys.
And I would just say along those lines, like, I hope you all heard how hard polling well is and how technical it is. And these folks are expert at it, and they work, and the science has come a huge long way over the last 100 years. And we're in a very different place. And so when people say, oh, you can't trust the polls, I always cringe when I hear that, because polling is a very trustworthy science. We just need to understand that appropriately, that it's an estimate. It's a very good estimate, especially when Laura's the one who's running these polls, right? And academic polls, by the way, you were asking before, I trust the academic polls the most because there's no incentive for the academics to get to have it this way or that.
I'd probably just say, whether it's looking at polling data and trying to use it, or any other type of political information, it's a different era now than like when I was a college student, looking forward to becoming an alumnus sometime and back on that. In that, everybody's got one of these, which means we've got more information than we know what to do with it. And society's had a hard time screening out bad information from good information. That's true for polling, and it's true for almost anything else. So in terms of being a good consumer of political information, whether you're conservative or liberal or some ideology that we haven't defined yet, doesn't matter what, just tune out the noise. The noise part of it, whether it is the poll is catastrophic at this point or it's overwhelming, none of them are going to be that way this time. Anyway, or if it's political information, just stupid entertainment part. Just kind of tune that part out. There's politics is important, but there's other parts of life. So don't waste time on the crap that you'll find out here. Political, polling, any other type. Focus on just the good stuff. Do other things. And I think we'd be a much happier society if we did that. Focus on the stuff you need to, and don't get just dragged into the rabbit hole of stuff you can find. Because whether it's polling or political information or anything else, there's a lot of really, really bad information I can pull up in just a couple of minutes on here.
Well, I think that's a great place to end, and I know we'll stick around for a few minutes if you guys have some additional questions that you want to ask us directly. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for people watching our recorded panel, and thank you to the Alumni Affairs Department, Division, for hosting this and for putting this together and making this possible. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Teresa.